So what we're going to go into is talking about the 7 primary domains of impairment. How does complex trauma impact kids on multiple different levels? These are those 7 domains and just an example of what we're going to get into in just a minute. Exposure to extremely stressful situations that one can't change or escape from can have profound effects on anyone, regardless of age. It can alter how we see the world, how we see others, and how we perceive our own worth. We know that these events don't occur in isolation. Very rarely do they occur in isolation. We know that when we see abuse, that these children are typically being exposed to neglectful environments. We know that when children are being abused and neglected, that quite often they're living in a domestic violence situation. Family violence is something that has really come to the surface lately, but you can't report domestic violence and have a child removed from their home. So there are a lot of kids, unless you're getting into a situation that is really chronic and really pervasive and you can start to demonstrate that there's a lot of other stuff going on, there are a lot of these kids that are living in violent homes that may not be victimized themselves, but they are experiencing watching a parent get victimized on a regular basis, and that is extremely traumatic for a child, and it creates a sense of fear and a lack of safety within their caregiving system. Okay. So what are some of the factors that influence how a child responds? It's going to be both the nature and the perception of their experience. Is this a normal experience for the child, or is this something that has come out of the blue? You have to remember that complex trauma typically starts from an acute event. It has to start someplace. And so the first time that a child experiences trauma is going to look very different in terms of how that child responds to that trauma, both in terms of their caregiving system and in terms of at school or in their community or anywhere else, than what it would look like for a child who has been exposed to prolonged, multiple, repeated events, because there's going to be desensitization that occurs. And that's really sad to think about. But kids are resilient. We're going to talk about resilience in a minute, but there are a lot of children that violence becomes predictable for them. It becomes a predictable pattern in their life. And so their reactions, their external reactions may look very different than a child who has been exposed to a violent situation for the first time, because unfortunately they're learning how to cope and survive and deal with it. The age of the child is going to have a key piece in terms of how they respond, because obviously our little guys don't have the verbal skills to express what's going on yet. So it's going to look different than kids who have the verbal capacity to express what it is that's happening to them. Characteristics of the child: this is their temperament, this is their personality. Are they introverted or extroverted? What kind of support system do they have? Risk and protective factors, we're going to touch on those briefly. And then how is he or she responded to or supported by their family or their community? Family violence is going to have a little bit of a different look and feel to it than community violence or peer violence or school violence is going to look. So you have to look at where is the exposure coming from and what is the support that that child has in order to engage and respond effectively to what's going on to them. Frequency and severity are also going to be issues. How often is this occurring? Is it occurring in the child's home? Is it occurring directly to them? Are they the one that's being victimized, or are they just exposed to the victimization that's occurring? We talked about age of onset. Cognitive reserves, capacity, and adaptability. This is really important, and we're going to talk about neurodevelopment in a little bit, but a child's cognitive capacity and how much they have stored inside them to create resiliency and to foster those positive behaviors is going to be a really big buffer against how exposure impacts them, as well as their emotional reserves, capacity, and adaptability. And then, of course, the external resources for a child to understand and cope. And this is where all of you come into play, because we can't always change the environment that a child is living in, but when they're in contact with us, we can do lots of things to support them and create relationship with them that can go a long way in making a difference. Okay. I'm going to touch briefly on risk and protective factors because most of you, I'm sure, have heard ad nauseum about risk and protective factors. The protective factors, these are the things that buffer our kids from adversity. These are the things that we want to really encourage the growth and development of, because the more our kids have of these things, the better they're going to fare when they come into adverse situations. And that's going to be positive temperament. This is something that can be taught. It's something that, your temperament is something that you're not necessarily born with. You're genetically predisposed to it, but these are things that can be taught. Child's intellectual capacity, their social competence, secure attachments, we're going to talk about attachment in a second, and living in supportive and safe environments and close-knit communities. Okay. The risk factors, obviously, these are going to be the things that make it harder for kids to be resilient and come out of whatever situation that they're living in. Premature birth is a risk factor, parent mental illness, substance abuse of caregivers, exposure to violence, poverty, and homelessness are all risk factors, and these are the things that we want to try to mediate. I love this quote by Ernest Hemingway: "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places." We're going to talk about resiliency now, and I think that this really speaks to our children that are resilient. So, what is resiliency? I think if you look at the definition that we're using, tied to the ability to learn and live with ongoing fear and uncertainty, namely the ability to show positive adaptation in spite of significant life adversities and the ability to adapt difficult and challenging life experiences. You all know these kids. You have been exposed to kids who you know have gone through some just horrible, awful stuff. But if you didn't know about the horrible, awful stuff, you wouldn't know that they've gone through it, because they don't look any different from a child who hasn't experienced it. They're resilient. There's something going on with these particular kiddos that's different. And there's been a really significant investment into research to looking at what it is about these children that allows them to overcome the odds. So how does stress play a role in terms of resilience? Well, we know that not all stressful events lead to adverse outcomes. Stress can be adaptive. And most of you in the room who have experienced some kind of stressful situation know that stress can be adaptive. You know, it can keep you on your game. It can keep you focused. Most of us, when we encounter a stressful event, will pretty quickly overcome depending on what that stress is. But we have learned coping skills. We've learned how to function in stressful environments, and we've learned how to manage our stress. Kids that are living in complex trauma don't have that skill. It's never been developed. And so what this slide is highlighting is that for most of us, when stress is predictable and stress is moderate, that leads to increased resilience. When stress is unpredictable and stress is severe, that leads to vulnerability. And that's the side of the continuum that most of the kids who are living in complex trauma are living on. So what do we know from the research? The research tells us that half to two-thirds of the kids who are living in complex trauma actually grow up and overcome the odds. That's really exciting. A half to two-thirds of these kids that are growing up in these environments are turning out okay. And I want to highlight that because it's really easy for us to get lost in how awful the stuff is that we see in these kids on a day-to-day basis. And especially in our older kids, our middle and high school kids that have endured such extreme circumstances for such a prolonged period of time, a lot of times we get that hopelessness, like, oh, this, how many times have you heard, this kid is so damaged, it's too late that we can do anything with them? Not true. And so we're going to be talking a lot about the impact, but I really want to emphasize the fact that these kids can come out okay. Kids may be resilient in one aspect of their lives and not in another. And so it's important to recognize these are the kids that you might see that are excelling in school, and then they come home and they fall apart. Or the kids that are holding it together, more commonly, holding it together at home because their environment is not safe, and they come to school and they lose it and they fall apart. And then you end up as a teacher, for example, having a conference and meeting with a parent, and you're like, and you have these team meetings, and you're trying to strategize about what's going on with this child in your classroom, and you're like, I don't know what's going on. This kid is out of control. They can't focus. They're not paying attention. They're disruptive. I have no idea what's going on. And then you meet with the parent, and the parent's like, I don't know what you're talking about. My child is well behaved. They do their chores. They keep their room clean. They mind their manners. And there's this huge disconnect. Resiliency doesn't have to show itself in every domain of a child's life, and typically it doesn't. The other thing to remember about resilience is that it's fluid over time, and we see this a lot in our kids when they're in big transitions. Typically in school we see this in transition from elementary to middle school, and from middle school to high school. You might see a child who's functioning really, really well, and then they go through that transition and everything falls apart for them. It's really hard for these kids to manage everything that they're trying to manage in their world and do that effectively all the time. There's also some really big developmental things that are happening for kids at those stages, and what's going on developmentally for children really plays an impact and plays a part in how they're going to foster resiliency and how they're going to demonstrate how resilient they are. So you have to keep that in mind. Another big piece around transitions is that for kids who are removed from their caregiving environment and are placed in a foster care situation, this is a huge transition. And a lot of times you see kids who are resilient waxing and waning during that transition, because we have to remember, especially for those of us on the professional side who are doing the placing or doing the professional support, just because we might be doing the right thing by removing a child from an unsafe environment and placing them in a foster home doesn't mean that the act of removal itself isn't extremely traumatizing for those kids. And oftentimes we forget about that fact because we say, well, gosh, we're helping this child, we're doing the right thing, we're putting them in a safe place. And that's really great, but that child is still being taken away from their parent. Part of the reason why you did the exercise that you did this morning is to get folks out of your comfort zone and to be thinking with that frame of reference in mind. A lot of times we forget about how scary of an experience that is for a child, and that it's really going to affect their response in all of their domains of their life. Okay, go ahead. Okay. So how does trauma impact children? What does it look like? We're going to talk about the domains of impairment. And genetics, temperament, physical health, a child's experience, and their relationship with their primary caregiver are all going to be things that help to make up a child's personality. And each of them help determine the extent of the impact that complex trauma is going to have on that child, and also their resiliency to those events. Complex trauma outcomes are most likely to develop and persist if an infant or child is exposed to danger that is unpredictable and uncontrollable, because the child's body must allocate resources that are normally dedicated to growth and development instead to survival. Why is this important to know? If children are expending vast amounts of their energy just to cope and just to survive on a day-to-day basis, they are depleting all of the other resources that they have within them to do all of the other things that they need to do, like, for example, sit in a classroom and learn. When you are in survival mode as a child and your world is unpredictable and it's unsafe, you spend most of your time and most of your resources just trying to figure out how you're going to get through the day and how you're going to get to tomorrow. And if that's what you're spending all of your energy on, it's going to be really hard for you to sit in a classroom and focus on what's being written on the board, or focus on what that lesson plan for the day is, or focus on making sure you get your homework assignment written down, put in your backpack, brought home so that you can take it out and do it, and then remember to put it back in your backpack and turn it in the next day. These kids have a ton of stuff going on, and it's really easy for us to forget that those tasks that we think oftentimes should be fairly simple, especially if we give really good, clear direction, are not simple for these kids because they don't have the physical or the emotional resources and capacity to do the things that kids who are not experiencing trauma can do very easily. So these are the 7 primary identified domains of impairment that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the morning. Attachment, biology. We've combined emotional and behavioral regulation, primarily for the sake of time, into self-regulation, so we're actually going to talk about 6 today. Dissociation and cognition and self-concept. And before we go on, one of the pieces that you don't have in your packet and that we don't have time to go over today is the impact that trauma has on each of these domains at each different developmental stage. And this is something that I think is a really important piece of information, but we could spend a whole day talking about it. So it's in the full packet. And what we've done is we've broken it down for each of the domains we've talked about. How does this affect a child who is from birth to 3 versus, early childhood to middle childhood to early adolescence to late adolescence? We've broken that down by developmental stage because I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that as our children grow and develop, there are a lot of things that are happening to them developmentally that are going to impact both how the traumatic experience affects them and then how they respond to that trauma externally. And those are going to be things that change over time. Unfortunately, like I said, it's going to take hours to go through that material, so it was something that we put in your packet, and I think it's a really good resource for you. So I'm going to bring us back to John. And as you can see from the description on the screen, John had a little incident at school. So John got into a fight. And apparently there were lots of other kids that saw the fight and saw that John was not the instigator. But as you remember from the description previously, the principal had told John if he had one more violent incident at school, he was out. So, 3 strikes. What do you think might be going on for John right now as he's sitting in the principal's office and he's got all these other kids that are saying, you know what, this was not John's fault, he didn't do this, but he's our troublemaker, he's got a short fuse, he's obviously violent, and the principal had already said, you know what, you do it again, I'm going to have to expel you. What do you think's going on for him right now? Scared? Mm-hmm.
He's seeing it, kids are losing his trust.
Losing his trust.
Anger.
Anger?
He's in trauma. He's in big trauma. He doesn't want to go home.
He doesn't want to go home.
No, he's in big
No, he doesn't want to go home. And so the principal didn't listen to him and instead picked up the phone. Yes?
This may be one of his only resources is school, and now he doesn't have that. He's probably going to help.
The comment was that school may be the only resource for this particular child, so he's probably feeling pretty helpless. Yes?
He may be homeless.
He may be homeless. There could be 100 different things that are going on in this scenario that make John not want the principal to expel him and pick up the phone and call his parents right now. And we don't know what that is. But we know that there are probably some assumptions that were made by this particular principal about how to deal with the situation. What do you think's going on for the principal right now? What was that? Discussing with the child. Okay. Probably glad he gets to send him home. Yes.
Probably has to do with the schedule that they're on. And they have to give people students the same typing. Well, it would probably both be together.
Right. So the comment was it could have to do with the discipline schedule, and that both, because there were 2 students that were involved in the altercation, they might both have to go. We don't know that, but that could be very possible. Yes?
He doesn't seem to be flexible at all.
He doesn't seem to be flexible. That's right.
But on the other hand, if he doesn't do something, he may get flagged back from parents and things because this child is quote unquote seen as a disruptor, and what are you going to do about it? And if you don't do something, you're not going to.
Right. So that principal may be kind of in a stuck situation in that, one, he said, You do it again, you're out. And there obviously are safety issues that have to be taken into consideration for other students in the building. And he might be feeling pressure that if he's, because the comment was that he wasn't flexible, but if he increases his flexibility and allows the student to stay after he's already said that if something else happens, he's going to have to go, then how will he be viewed and what kind of flack will he have to get from other parents who then might call and say, well, wait a minute, this kid's a disruption, he shouldn't be here. So this is one of those instances, and this kind of stuff happens all the time in schools, where you have an administrator that might be stuck in a very tough position because there are some things that have to happen in schools. And part of this is about teaching responsibility and accountability, and there's this mantra out there about, well, kids have to be accountable for their actions and their behaviors, and that obviously it's not okay to be violent, it's not okay to hurt other students, it's not okay to create an unsafe atmosphere in your school. So how do you balance that with understanding that there's more going on than what you might actually be seeing? And that's the piece that we're going to keep coming back to. When we talked about this in one of the other trainings that I did, the comment came up, well, you can't just assume that this child is a trauma victim and, you know, slap him on the wrist and then let him go. He needs to learn that he's accountable for his actions. And if this is the third or the fourth time that this kid has had an issue and has come into the office, the principal may not have a choice. And that's very true. And the piece that we then talked about was the fact that where we're talking about creating this approach, you would be creating it back 3 steps at the first incident. And you wouldn't necessarily be allowing this child in this particular situation to get to the point of expulsion because you've created a trauma-sensitive environment within your school where you're identifying issues early, you're creating supportive environments, and you're creating a relationship with kids to understand what's going on with them before they get to the point where they need to be expelled. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get down the road. So think about John. I'm going to let you know what's going on with John right before lunch. Now we're going to talk about attachment. And the thing to remember about attachment from the research perspective is that attachment, a healthy and secure attachment, has been the one piece that has been researched that folks are saying is the strongest buffer against adverse events. So if you can create a secure and healthy attachment with a child, that is going to be the most predictive buffer against experiencing lifelong adverse experiences. And so we want to do what we can to promote healthy and secure attachments in our children. When we talk about attachment, we're talking about the bonds of love between child and parent. And I'm using the word parent in this slide, but whenever I'm talking about parent, remember, I'm talking about anybody who is a caregiver for the child. And we're not necessarily talking about biological parents or natural parents, because we know that the kids that we're working with are living in multiple varied situations. And so we talk initially about the bonds of attachment that happen between a child and their natural parent, but we know that that natural caregiving relationship is oftentimes disrupted because of trauma, and we need to be able to create these types of relationships with whatever the child views as their caregiving system. This relationship provides the scaffolding for the growth of many developmental competencies. We know that a secure attachment pattern is present in between about half and 2/3 of the population, which is really great. We've got it right in a lot of cases, and that's something that we can be really excited about. But what we also know that the research tells us is that insecure attachment patterns have been consistently documented in over 80% of maltreated children. And so our kids who are living in complex traumatic environments, again, are at a huge disadvantage because we've already talked about risk factors. And then we talk about the fact that having a healthy attachment is going to be the biggest buffer against how they're going to respond to adversity. And these kids don't have it. They're not starting with it, and they don't develop it, and it's really hard for them to learn how to develop it. And so we have to figure out what we can do as healthy, positive adults in the lives of these kids to promote healthy and positive attachments. And when I talk about insecure attachment patterns, I'm talking about things like avoidant and ambivalent types of patterns that you see in kids, and we're going to talk about what that looks like in just a second. Our sense of I is profoundly influenced by how we belong to a we. I think that it's really important to recognize that who we are, especially as children, is so greatly shaped by our experience as part of a family. And so our relationships with our caregivers, our relationships with our siblings, our relationships with extended family, all of that helps shape who we are. And who we become and who we develop is really impacted by the relationships that we have with other people and how we navigate through those relationships. And so we need to remember that kids who are growing up in complex traumatic environments are really struggling because they don't necessarily have the experience of being supported, being loved, being appreciated, bonding with people in the way that we kind of in society think and expect that that should happen. Okay. So what do we know about people? Well, we're all human, and people are relational beings. We know that trauma can fundamentally interfere with and change how children engage and succeed in relationships with their caring adults. This is how accessible the adult is to that child. This is how the child learns to navigate through relationships with their adult. Kids are really smart, and kids learn very early on how to cue off their parents or how to cue off other adults that are in their world. We could spend a week just talking about attachment. Obviously, we don't have the time to do that, and I've outlined in your packet how attachment is disrupted at different developmental stages and how that impacts a child who is experiencing trauma. But what we know is that the quality of care and relationship directly influence how the genome is expressed in the growing child, and we're going to talk about that when we get to brain development. But what we know is that kids are learning who they are and how to behave and how to interact by how they're interacting with the person in their primary caregiving relationship. And so they're learning how to cue off of folks. They're learning how to read nonverbal body language. They're learning what's safe to do and what's not safe to do. They're learning how to approach and engage people that they think might be safe versus how not to with people that aren't safe. And they're doing this very, very early on. I tell a story about a girl that we had worked with who was living in her home with her mother and her father. Dad was an alcoholic and was abusing mom on a very regular basis. So this was a pretty violent home. And she did not have a secure attachment with either one of her parents from a very early age because she had learned that dad was not safe and that mom could not protect her. And what she did was she started to learn to base her involvement with her parents based on how dad was coming home from work. And they lived in a house on a gravel driveway. And what she learned to do was listen to the sound of the car as it came up the driveway every night when dad came home from work. And what she knew was that if she didn't hear anything, if the car came to a quiet stop, if she didn't hear gravel flying around, that it was probably going to be an okay night, and that she could come out and she could seek the type of engagement that she wanted to seek to create a healthy relationship with her parents. But she knew if that car went flying around the corner and tires were squealing and gravel was flying and it was really loud and the car door slammed, she hot-footed it to her room and she shut the door and she did not come out because it meant that dad was drunk and he was going to beat mom and that it wasn't a safe place to be. And that was how she learned how to navigate her world. A lot of times we don't pick up on the fact that if kids are not directly being victimized, that they're not being affected. And I know that I've talked about this a couple of times already, but I really want to emphasize the point. Because there is so much of our experience that is shaped by our immediate world, and we don't often recognize, because for this particular child, she went through years of victimization without actually physically being abused before she even came to anybody's attention, because she wasn't getting beaten. And so nobody was paying attention and people weren't calling. And nobody really knew what was going on because she happened to be a particularly resilient child. And so she was coming to school where it was a safe place. She didn't want to let anybody know about what was going on because, of course, those are her parents. She wants her family intact. She loves her parents no matter how unsafe she feels there. And so she wasn't going to go to school and share her story with someone that might pull her out of her home and break apart her family. So she went to school and she held it together, and nobody knew this was happening for years. That had a tremendous impact on her, and she was not the direct victim of what was happening. So how does complex trauma impact, or how does attachment impact complex trauma and exposure to complex trauma? That's what I should have said. These kids have problems with boundaries. You guys know these kids. I'm sure you've seen them. These are the kids that don't know you at all. You're a total stranger, and they come up into the grocery store and they grab you on the leg and they hug you. Or they meet you for the first time and they want to hug and kiss you, and they want you to touch them and they want that closeness. These are kids that don't understand what healthy boundaries are. These are also kids, the converse of that are the kids that avoid touch. Touch makes them feel very uncomfortable. You want to support them. And most of us who have healthy, secure attachments, when a child is in distress, we want to comfort them. We want to put our arm around them. We want to hug them or rub their back or hold their hand. These kids get very uncomfortable by that. They don't like it. And so they do this approach avoid thing. They want you to be there for them, but it's uncomfortable, and so then they back away. These are kids that typically don't like eye contact. This might be the child that's in your classroom, for example, that you're trying to have a conversation with, and they're scanning, and they'll do whatever they can to distract from actually making eye contact with you. And you'll be like, right here, I'm right here. Focus, focus, I need to know that you hear what I'm saying. And for us, the way that we know that a child is paying attention and listening is by looking at us. But for kids who have disrupted attachments, making eye contact and actually having that engagement is very uncomfortable for them. And so it doesn't mean that they don't want to listen to you or hear what you have to say or that they're not paying attention, but it's very awkward and it's very uncomfortable, and so they look away. So that's important to remember. These kids are often very hesitant to look toward adults for attention and support. We're not reliable or predictable in their eyes. They want us to be there, but they don't trust us. So they're going to pull away even though they really need us to be there. And that can be a very confusing message for an adult that is trying to help and support a child, because we know that we have things in our little tool bags that might be really helpful for these kids. And they really want it, but they don't know how to get it because there's a disconnect, and we're going to talk about this in a second, between what we say and what they hear, and what we say and what they're afraid we may or may not do. Because they can't trust us, because that trust has not been formed. So there's a lot of uncertainty about reliability and predictability of the world. These are kids that have oftentimes not developed what we call object constancy. They don't know if you go away that you're going to come back. And I talk about this. I've been doing a lot of traveling lately, and my daughter is 4. But I started making my road trips when she was like 2. And the first couple of trips were really hard because, of course, I would tell her I was going to leave, and I was going to tell her I was going to come back, and of course I can tell her I'm going to come back at 5 o'clock, or I can tell her I'm going to come back in June, and that doesn't matter because she has no concept of time at 2. And so I would leave, and she would get really upset, and of course that would make me really upset because I wouldn't be there to comfort her. And then I would come back, just like I said I was going to come back, and she'd be really mad at me. You know, and at first it was, Mommy's home, and she gives me a big hug, and then she would act out, and she wouldn't listen to me, or, you know, she would have a little fit, or whatever it was that she would do for a very brief period of time, and then she would come back to me because she knew it was okay. And now at 4, because she has the verbal capacity, she can understand, and so I have demonstrated a pattern of behavior now with her that she knows if I leave, I'm going to come back. Whether that's that I'm leaving for the grocery store and I'll be back in half an hour, or that I'm leaving and I'm going to Seattle and I'm coming back in 2 days. You know, and we have our little calendar and we do our little thing. And now she doesn't get upset when I leave because she knows I'm going to come back, because every time I come back. These kids who have disrupted attachment patterns don't understand that concept. And people that are trusting adults, or that they view as trusting and safe adults, hurt them. And they hurt them over and over. And so then when we come in and we say, we're going to help and support you, and we're going to be that person that's not going to leave you, we're not going to abandon you, we're going to be there for you. And then you say, I'm going to go to the grocery store, but I'll be back in 15 minutes. These kids will have a meltdown. They will lose it. How many of you that are foster parents have seen this? Where you have a child that comes into your home and they're starting to get settled and they're starting to adjust, and you're trying to create a relationship with them, and then you say, but I have to leave. I have to go to the school, or I have to go to a meeting, or I have to go to an appointment, or I have to go shopping, or I have to go downstairs and do the laundry. And this child is like this because they don't want you to leave, because they don't believe if you leave them that you're going to come back. That experience can be very traumatic in and of itself. We've talked about difficulty forming trusting relationships, and these kids have a really hard time interpreting emotional signals. This is what I hear versus what you've said, and your nonverbal cues. Because typically, again, we talked about living in an unpredictable environment. These are kids that are living in very, very unpredictable situations, and their world has not been stable for them. And so it doesn't really matter that you tell them that it's going to be okay, because their experience tells them that it's not.